In the winter of 1889, two gunshots shattered more than the silence of a remote Austrian hunting lodge. They destroyed a young woman's future, condemned her to decades of blame, and changed the course of European history forever. Princess Stéphanie of Belgium was just 24 years old when she became the most hated woman in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what her husband had chosen to do without her. On January 30th, 1889, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria was found dead alongside his 17-year-old mistress at Mayerling hunting lodge. The scandal that followed didn't just end a marriage, it toppled governments, sparked conspiracy theories that persist today, and left one woman to carry the weight of an empire's grief. But this isn't just the story of the Mayerling tragedy. This is the story of a woman who survived the unthinkable, who rebuilt her life from ashes, and who ultimately chose love over duty in an act of defiance that shocked royal Europe. Today, we uncover the truth about Princess Stéphanie, the scapegoat who became a survivor, the widow who found freedom, and the woman whose greatest triumph was learning to live for herself. The Gilded Cage. Our story begins not with tragedy, but with what appeared to be a fairy tale. Born into the Belgian royal house on May 21, 1864, Princess Stéphanie Clotilde Louise Herminie Marie Charlotte seemed destined for greatness. But her childhood was far from warm. Her father, King Leopold II, was consumed by his brutal exploitation of the Congo. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, retreated into isolation. At just 6 years old, Stéphanie nearly died from typhus, spending weeks unconscious while her family prepared for her death. When Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary visited the Belgian court in March 1880, it seemed destiny was finally smiling on the young princess. Rudolf was heir to one of Europe's most powerful empires, a dashing, intelligent man who represented everything a royal marriage should be. But here's what the fairy tale didn't reveal. Rudolf hadn't chosen Stéphanie. She was simply the last acceptable option on a dwindling list of Catholic princesses. His heart belonged to his quiet, sickly cousin, but his parents had rejected her as unsuitable for an empress. On March 5, 1880, King Leopold stood before his 15-year-old daughter and declared, "The Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary has come here to ask for your hand. We have chosen you to be Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. Think about it and give us your answer tomorrow." Imagine being 15 years old and having your entire future decided in a single conversation. Stéphanie had one night to contemplate becoming the most powerful woman in Central Europe, and she had no choice but to say yes. The wedding, delayed because Stéphanie had not yet reached physical maturity, finally took place on May 10, 1881. She was barely 17, walking down the aisle in a gown of heavy silver brocade. But it was what adorned her that truly captured the imagination of all who witnessed this imperial spectacle. Upon her dark hair sat a magnificent diamond tiara, a personal wedding gift from Emperor Franz Joseph himself. Created by the legendary French jeweler Chaumet, this masterpiece featured a grand floral motif of diamonds that seemed to capture every candle flame in the cathedral. Cascading from her shoulders was perhaps the most extraordinary bridal veil ever created. Commissioned by her mother from Belgium's master lace merchant Léon Sacré, this wasn't merely a veil, it was a work of art. Crafted entirely from Brussels Point de Gaze needle lace, it featured 21 coats of arms, every Belgian province and Austro-Hungarian territory represented in tiny, perfect detail. Yet it was the third element that would prove most prophetic. The city of Budapest presented Stéphanie with what can only be described as a treasure beyond imagination, a complete Hungarian opal parure. Picture a jewelry set so spectacular it defied description. The centerpiece was a wide belt of linked gold medallions, each centered with a fiery Hungarian opal encircled by diamonds. The matching necklace featured 303 individual opals and over 1,100 diamonds. The Hungarian opals, prized for their spectacular play of colour, seemed to contain entire rainbows within their depths. The complete set included delicate earrings, 6 pairs of decorative buckles, and 5 hairpins. Valued at 50,000 florins, a fortune that could have purchased entire estates, this wasn't merely jewellery. It was a promise of acceptance, of belonging, of the glittering future that awaited Hungary's future queen. As Stéphanie stood at the altar that May morning, adorned with the Emperor's diamonds, wrapped in Belgium's finest lace, and knowing that Hungary's opals awaited her, she must have felt like the most fortunate woman in Europe. But promises, as Stéphanie would learn, are easily broken. The marriage unravels. What began as a diplomatic triumph quickly descended into personal hell. Rudolf had already brought one of his mistresses to Belgium during their engagement, and his infidelities continued throughout their marriage with devastating consequences. The couple's only child, Archduchess Elisabeth Marie, was born on September 2, 1883. But instead of bringing them closer, motherhood became another source of pain. Rudolf's reaction to his daughter's birth was one of barely concealed disappointment. He had wanted a male heir. Then came the betrayal that would destroy everything. Rudolf contracted syphilis during one of his countless affairs and transmitted it to his young wife. The disease ravaged Stéphanie's reproductive system, leaving her unable to have more children at just 22 years old. Imagine the crushing weight of that realization. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce heirs, Stéphanie had become, through no fault of her own, a dynastic failure. The very purpose of their political marriage, to secure the succession, had been destroyed by her husband's reckless behavior. Empress Elisabeth, Rudolf's mother, made no secret of her disdain for her daughter-in-law, cruelly calling her an ugly bumpkin. The woman who should have been Stéphanie's greatest ally became one of her harshest critics. The magnificent Hungarian opals that had once symbolized acceptance now seemed to mock her. The promise of belonging that Budapest had offered through those spectacular gems felt hollow as the court blamed her for every failure, every disappointment. By 1888, Rudolf's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He was drinking heavily, taking morphine for his deteriorating health, and his affairs had become more brazen. Among his mistresses was 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera, a girl barely older than Stéphanie had been when she married Rudolf. Stéphanie watched helplessly as her husband spiraled into self-destruction. She had tried to warn Emperor Franz Joseph about Rudolf's condition, but her concerns were dismissed. The court that blamed her for everything refused to listen when she tried to prevent the ultimate tragedy. The Mayerling Incident. January 30th, 1889. The date that would forever divide Stéphanie's life into before and after. At the remote hunting lodge of Mayerling, Crown Prince Rudolf spent his final hours with Marie Vetsera. What transpired in that room remains one of history's greatest mysteries, but the outcome was devastatingly clear. Rudolf shot his young mistress, then turned the gun on himself. When the bodies were discovered the next morning, the Austro-Hungarian Empire faced its greatest crisis since its founding. The heir to the throne was dead, the succession was in chaos, and someone had to be blamed. That someone was Stéphanie, the woman who had been kept in the dark about her husband's final plans, who learned of his death from court officials rather than family, who was one of the last to be informed of the tragedy that had destroyed her life. She became the scapegoat for an empire's grief. Empress Elisabeth's reaction was swift and merciless. She blamed Stéphanie for Rudolf's death, claiming she was responsible for everything that had happened. The court that had never accepted the Belgian princess now had the perfect excuse to cast her out entirely. Rudolf's farewell letter to his wife was a final, cruel blow. "Dear Stéphanie, you are freed from my presence and vexation. Be happy in your own way." Even in death, he offered no comfort, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused her. At 24 years old, Stéphanie found herself a widow, blamed for a tragedy she couldn't have prevented, forbidden from returning to her homeland, and trapped in a court that viewed her as a living reminder of their greatest shame. The psychological toll was enormous. She later wrote of feeling in a state of inward collapse while maintaining a cool exterior for the world. The young woman who had once worn Hungarian opals as symbols of acceptance now wore only black, mourning not just her husband, but the life she had been promised and would never have. The widow's exile. For 11 long years, Stéphanie lived in a kind of gilded exile. She was forbidden from remarrying without imperial permission, cut off from her daughter who remained under the emperor's control, and isolated from the family that blamed her for their loss. But here's what makes Stéphanie's story remarkable. She didn't break. Instead, she began to rebuild herself piece by piece. She traveled extensively, pursuing interests in painting and music that had been suppressed during her marriage. She formed friendships with other royal outcasts, including Queen Elizabeth of Romania, who recognized the intensity of Stéphanie's suffering and encouraged her not to blame herself. Slowly, quietly, Stéphanie was preparing for the most audacious act of her life. In 1899, she wrote to Queen Victoria seeking support for her intention to remarry. The man she had chosen was Count Elemér Lónyay, a Hungarian nobleman who had shown her genuine affection, something she had never experienced in her first marriage. King Leopold II's response was swift and brutal. He refused his consent in the harshest terms, even threatening to withdraw her title of Royal Highness. The father, who had arranged her first loveless marriage, now tried to prevent her from finding happiness in a second. But Stéphanie had learned something during her years of exile. She was stronger than anyone had given her credit for. Love conquers duty. On March 22, 1900, at Miramar Castle near Trieste, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium made a choice that shocked royal Europe. She married Count Elemér Lónyay for love, knowing it would cost her everything she had been born to be. The price was immediate and severe. She lost her imperial titles, her place in the Habsburg succession, and her relationship with her daughter, who viewed the marriage as a betrayal of her father's memory. Emperor Franz Joseph reluctantly gave his permission, but Stéphanie had to renounce her rank to marry a mere count. But what she gained was infinitely more precious: genuine happiness. The couple settled at Rusovce Manor near Bratislava, where Stéphanie finally found the peace that had eluded her for so long. Here, she transformed herself from a tragic royal widow into something entirely new, an independent woman who controlled her own destiny. She became a passionate gardener, creating 3 spectacular gardens around the manor. She founded a successful nursery called Stéphaneum and was said to have created the most beautiful garden in the whole country. The woman who had once been confined to the rigid protocols of imperial court life now had dirt under her fingernails and flowers in her hair. For 45 years, Stéphanie and Elemér lived in devoted happiness. Their marriage, born from choice rather than duty, became a testament to the power of love over obligation. She had traded a crown for contentment and never once regretted the exchange. The final act of defiance. In 1935, at the age of 71, Stéphanie committed her final act of rebellion against the forces that had tried to silence her. She published her memoirs, pointedly titled Je devais être impératrice. I had to be empress. This wasn't just a recollection of her life, it was a reclamation of her narrative. For decades, others had told her story: the court that blamed her, the historians who dismissed her, the family that cast her out. Now, finally, she would tell it herself. The book was scandalous for its candor, particularly in its unflinching portrayal of Rudolf's dissolute behavior and the court's treatment of her after his death. It was banned in Austria at the behest of the Habsburg family, but Stéphanie didn't care. She had found her voice at last. The end came quietly in 1945. As World War II drew to a close, the elderly couple was forced to flee their beloved Rusovci as the Red Army advanced. They found refuge at Pannonhalma Arkaby in Hungary, where Stéphanie died peacefully on August 23, 1945, at the age of 81. She was buried beside her beloved Elemér in the Abbey's cemetery, far from the imperial tombs of Vienna, but exactly where she belonged, next to the man who had loved her for herself, not for the crown she might have worn. The crown she never wore. Princess Stéphanie's story asks us to reconsider what we mean by success, by duty, and by happiness. She was blamed for a tragedy she didn't cause, exiled from a life she never chose, and ultimately found freedom in letting go of everything she was supposed to want. The Hungarian opals from her wedding, those magnificent symbols of a future that never came to pass, have long since disappeared into history. The spectacular Chaumet tiara that once crowned her with imperial diamonds vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. Even that extraordinary Brussels lace veil, now safely preserved in the Smithsonian, serves as a reminder that some treasures survive while others are lost forever. But the legacy of the woman who wore them, her courage, her resilience, her ultimate triumph over those who tried to define her, that sparkles still more brilliantly than any jewel ever could. In a world that told her she was a failure because she couldn't produce male heirs, because she couldn't save her husband from himself, because she chose love over duty, Stéphanie wrote her own definition of success. She survived the unsurvivable. She loved when love seemed impossible. She lived on her own terms when the world demanded she live on theirs. The princess, who was blamed for a crown prince's death, became something far more valuable than an empress. She became herself. She became free. She became a woman who understood that the greatest jewels are not those we wear around our necks, but the strength we carry in our hearts. The crown she never wore, the crown of authentic happiness, proved to be the most beautiful jewel of all. What do you think of Princess Stéphanie's remarkable journey from scapegoat to survivor? Have you ever had to choose between what others expected of you and what your heart truly wanted? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how her story resonates with you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into royal history, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of remarkable royal women who chose courage over comfort, authenticity over approval, and love over duty.